Do you find yourself having a plan and then you run out of gas or focus to keep that plan going? Maybe your kids are not doing what you rehearsed in your mind, so now you don't know what to do. And it seems like your idea isn't fitting this situation. Well, what's going on here? If this happens to you, hang tight. We will be discussing this today. Does your child have a speech-language delay and you really want them to talk? Do difficult behaviors derail home life and you know the frustration is a communication struggle? Does your child see a speech therapist and you wonder, what do they do and how can I help? If these or similar questions are in your mind, this podcast is for you. Hello, my name is Dinalynn Rosenbusch. I am a speech-language pathologist that has worked with children from birth to 21 for 3 decades. And in my classrooms, I see you wanting to connect with the heart of your child, but their speech and language skills create a barrier. So if you have a kiddo that has difficult behaviors, needs to expand their language or learn to say speech sounds, and maybe even receives speech therapy, stay tuned, because in this podcast, you will learn how to use your daily life as a tool to communication practice and how to do that practice. You will become confident knowing you are making the difference you want to make. And you will hear success stories of parents who have navigated these struggles already. We'll do this all while focusing on building deep, meaningful connection and confidence in your kiddo. So grab a cup of coffee along with a notebook and pen. It's time to speak in the way your child's brain understands. And that is the language of play. Welcome back to the language of play. Recently, I listened to a disheartened mom speak. She was exhausted. She was trying to teach her child to speak instead of scream. She wanted to use timeouts effectively and not to be exhausted all the time. She wanted her child to communicate differently, and she wanted to have a productive home. But she always felt like she was behind the 8 ball when she was training her kids. Now, for those of you that don't know the expression behind the 8 ball, that term comes from the game of pool. You try to get your balls into the different pockets on the table. If the 8 ball goes into the pocket before the rest of your balls are shot in, you automatically lose. And sometimes during play, the 8 ball ends up right between the pocket and the ball you're trying to shoot in, and you are behind the 8 ball. So unless you can navigate really a tricky maneuver to get your ball to go around the 8 ball to get to the pocket, you lose. In this game, you don't want the 8 ball to go in until all the other balls have been in. So that's the expression that we use for behind the 8 ball. If you feel like you are behind the 8 ball, that's pretty common. That happens to all of us at some point in our life, especially when we're in a field or a position and experience that we're not really comfortable in or used to. So if that's what you feel like in your parenting, let's talk about it. Email me at hello@thelanguageofplay.com and I would be happy to set up an appointment. What do we do when we are behind the 8 ball? Meaning we feel like we are about to lose. And unless we do things differently in a trickier strategic way or creative way that benefits us and our kids, we will lose. That's what we're talking about today. When we feel like we are stuck, we are behind that 8 ball, and we don't know how to connect with them because what we planned in our mind isn't matching the situation. So I'm going to nail it down to 3 main strategies. They are all important, and it's not the only way to do things. Like every time that I speak on this podcast, we need to remember that there's a lot of different ways to do just about everything. But here are some really, really important parts. First, recognize that this position feels vulnerable. And you might feel mad about it. So when you're in that position with your kids where you feel like, I can't change this situation. They're not behaving as I planned, and now I don't know what to do. I might be at a grocery store. I might be trying to put them to bed, whatever it is, and we feel stuck. Here are some questions to ask yourself. Take a little time, have some brain space, and ask yourself, how often has this been happening? Not necessarily the behavior specifically, but rather this feeling of being stuck. Is it really often? Is it really burdening you because it's a repetition? If so, this is something to really pay attention to. Chances are, if you're feeling stuck, it's because it has been happening often. And the second question to take your time with is, when does this happen? You might find yourself thinking, it happens before mealtime, or it happens when I'm trying to get out the door, or it happens at bedtime, or some other pattern. So if you start writing down the times or the events that are happening around this feeling you have, you might find that the when this is happening has a pattern. Look for that pattern. So the two questions that go with, recognize that this position is making you feel stuck. And notice when you have that frustration, ask yourself, 1, how often has it been happening? And 2, when does it happen? Now that you have done that, you step into the second phase. Second, you want to recognize what you want to have happen. Now, parents, what I typically see is that when we're in this state, and a lot of us are guilty of this, I will be too, especially if I'm working with computer stuff. That's where I have less capacity. Sometimes I get really frustrated and stuck. I need to find somebody else to help me. You've heard me say that before. But anyway, just know that I'm not judging that it happens. It happens to all of us. In that state, stop and think, what is it that you do want to have happen? When we're in that state, it's so easy to think about what we don't want. I don't want him to scream. I don't want him to make messes. I don't want him to spit his food on the floor. Whatever it is that you're wanting not to happen, that is not what I'm talking about. I am talking about what you do want. Now, there's a phrase that we use, and that phrase is, don't give me dead man goals. So, for example, if you tell me what you don't want your child to do, a dead man can do that. So it would be a dead man goal. If you don't want your child to spit, a dead man can do that. If you don't want your child to make noise, a dead man can do that. Do not make dead man goals for your child. Start thinking about what you do want and what you want both you and your child to do in a particular situation. There are many situations. And so I have a head full of them right now to pick from, and I wish I knew what your situation was, but I don't. You can email me and we can talk about that. But let me just pull some ideas from my mind. And let's say you want your child to come to dinner when called. Or maybe you want them to rinse their toothpaste down the sink. And maybe when you think about it, you can really only come up with stop hitting. And yet, that is a dead man goal. The phrasing that might go with stop hitting might be touch gently. The I want phrase that goes with a child who spits on the floor might be keep your food in your mouth. I want you to keep your food in your mouth. I want you to swallow. So this number 2 that I'm giving you is to recognize what you do want. And as you can probably notice, there comes to be really powerful language and thinking that happens when you start to think about what it is that you do want. Now, the mistake many times I see parents make is that they figure out what the child wants and they go that way. So, for example, if you want your child to eat their food, you would give them what they will eat. But ultimately, it's not that you want them to eat what they like. You want them to eat what is healthy. And so there's ways to train your children to eat just about any kind of food. And that, again, is something we could talk about if that's something that you particularly are struggling with. Sometimes it seems really nice to just choose what the child wants and go that way. If you find yourself getting frustrated because during the doing of their own thing, they didn't choose what you actually wanted, you realize there was something that maybe you weren't aware of, but there was something that you actually want. And when you figure it out, you go back to number 1 and you start thinking, I recognize this feeling. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling vulnerable, whatever this feeling is. And then you start to think about number 2, what you do want. And then you tell them. You tell the kiddos, here's what I want. Now that comes down then to the third thing, and that is, how do we reinforce it? How do we set boundaries around this idea that I have that I want my child to embrace? So number 3 is to set boundaries. This too is easier said than done. But first let's discuss what a boundary is. A boundary in this situation is deciding what is and is not okay. It's deciding what will you, mom and dad, accept from your child. Maybe, for example, I will accept them putting their hand on my leg or my shoulder to get my attention. And I will not accept patting, hitting, tapping while they're waiting for my attention. Or maybe it's shouting or interrupting. Deciding what is okay and what is not okay. That is what we're going with at this point for the definition of boundary. Here is another example of a boundary you might want to set. I will listen to my child when he speaks. I will not listen when they scream. And that would be, again, going to step 1 and noticing how you feel. And step 2, figuring out what you want. And then 3, now deciding a plan how to handle it. And the first step of that is setting your boundaries. Now, this is a habit that needs to be developed, especially if you have been allowing the scream to be how a child gets your attention. So when you develop your habit differently, remember that you are gently ushering your children into a new habit. And whenever we start to change our habits and it impacts them, there's some resistance because they suddenly get confused. What they did last time isn't working this time. I don't know what to do. So they will scream louder and stronger initially while they settle into what it is that is the new normal. So with this new normal, be sure to explain clearly to your kids what you want them to do, what you will accept, and what you will not accept. That leads us to, what are we going to do when the boundary is crossed? Because of course our kids are going to check to see if we're going to follow through. Remember, follow through is what teaches. Your words don't. So explain to your kids in a way that they understand at their level of development. Maybe you're going to role play. Maybe you will use stuffed animals to do the role play. Maybe you will talk to them, and maybe, well, of course you're going to talk to them, but maybe you will supplement with toys or some other method to help them understand at their level of development. Again, this is easier said than done, but it is still important because when you decide what your boundaries are going to be, this gives your child the target so that they know what they're shooting for. And when they shoot for the target, they will watch to see if you follow through. Follow through is what teaches, not your words. Let me repeat that. Follow through is what teaches, not your words. As a recap, when you feel stuck, like you're behind the 8 ball, you're about to lose, you don't know what to do, we recognize that familiar feeling, that feeling of stuck that is making us mad. We consider how often this has been happening, and we look for the patterns of when it's been happening. Second, recognize what you want. Remember, no dead man goals. And then third, we set our boundaries. We figure out what we think is okay and not okay, what I will accept and what I won't accept. Remember that kids will check to see if you're going to follow through when they cross that boundary. It's part of them learning what you mean by your boundaries. It is not necessarily an absolute affront to what it is that you're doing. Kids naturally check to see if the boundaries are firm. And then, remember, your follow-through is what teaches. It's not your words. So parents, I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear what you have to say about it. I know I didn't go into the specifics of how to reinforce those boundaries. And the reason I didn't go into that in this episode is because when we say something like time out, everybody has their own idea of what that means. When people say the words punishment, discipline, people have their own connotation of what those experiences are. I'm happy to address these topics, but I also want it to be its own episode where I can clearly create a picture of what I mean when I say those different words. So that'll be a different episode. And in the meantime, know that there are ways to use them effectively and there are ways that cause damage. It is best to take into account your personality and your child's personality, because whatever consequence we give that helps our children become disciplined, become cooperative members of our families, always includes love. It includes clear communication, and it includes holding boundaries that are going to be firm so that they know what they are, and it's also going to have some gentleness in those boundaries because they're going to slam against the boundaries, and that gentleness is called love. If that's ambiguous, you can email me at hello@thelanguageofplay.com and we can discuss how it pertains to you and your kiddo. Hey parents, I hope you found this episode helpful. If so, would you please take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who also lives or works with children? I would really appreciate it if you would leave a quick review for the show on Apple Podcasts. I read every review and it lights me up to know that this show is making a difference. Then come join my Facebook community, where you'll meet other parents who are dedicated to helping their children grow too. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me. Now it's time to go. Let's pop our kiddos in the strollers and go look around outdoors and see what we have to talk about.